Dinner at Elias's mom's place was always just loud enough to feel warm. I sat at the end of the table, listening to everyone's conversations like I usually did. Things only shifted when his cousin looked at me and asked, half joking, half not, "Is Marin always this serious?" Being that stiff must be exhausting. Everyone turned to Elias, as if he was the one who got to decide what kind of person I was. I stayed quiet, waiting for him to say something fair, or at least honest. But Elias just gave a small laugh, that familiar tilt of his head, and then he said, in this calm voice that made my skin crawl, "She's really sensitive, so don't mind her." The table cracked up, and I froze. Not because the comment was that harsh, but because it was exactly the route he always took. Avoid conflict, and place me in the role of the one who's too much so everything stays pleasant. I looked at Elias. He didn't look back. To explain why that sentence snapped me awake, I have to go back to the days when everyone thought he was the gentlest guy in the room. Back then, I believed it. And honestly, I wanted to believe it. Elias always showed up with this softness almost no one else had. He didn't talk much. He was polite, calm in a way that made people feel safe. I'm someone who doesn't like noise, doesn't like dragging anyone into conflict, so his quiet steadiness felt like something I could lean on. We got married in a calm autumn. I didn't think too hard about it. Elias was gentle, I was steady, and neither of us made waves. I thought that was enough. But after living together for a while, I started noticing what I didn't see in the beginning. Elias wasn't gentle. He avoided conflict so completely, it had become his default reaction. And the real problem was that he couldn't tell the difference between a conflict worth avoiding and a truth worth defending. The first time I really felt it was when our neighbor knocked on the door after a misunderstanding about parking. I had just opened my mouth to explain when Elias stepped beside me and whispered, barely loud enough for me to hear, "Let me apologize. It'll be quicker." Even though it wasn't my fault. Even though a simple explanation would have cleared everything up. He chose to apologize not out of politeness, but because he was afraid of having to say even one more sentence. I remember another time, during a hangout with mutual friends, someone told a story that made me look bad. I waited for Elias to clear it up. He just gave a polite smile and shrugged like it wasn't worth correcting. When I asked him why, he said, "If you make it a big deal, it'll ruin the vibe." I went quiet. Not because I agreed, but because I realized he was more afraid of conflict than he was of hurting me. I'm not someone who enjoys arguing. But I've always believed there are moments when you have to say what's true, especially when that truth is about you. I've never seen silence as a way to protect anyone. Elias was different. He used silence to hide his fear, and he used the appearance of gentleness to make people think it was kindness. The more time passed, the more his gentleness felt like a thin mist covering a dark room, pretty only from a distance. At home, whenever something needed to be discussed, Elias disappeared in spirit. I'd ask what he wanted for our future plans. He'd say, "Whatever you want is fine, I'll follow your lead." I'd ask how he felt when people misunderstood me. He'd say, "Come on, don't get upset. Everyone gets tired of explaining things." But the one who was tired was me. Elias didn't take anyone's side. He took the side of whatever kept the air the calmest. And most of the time, that meant not standing with me. What unsettled me wasn't that he didn't defend me. It was that he never even saw it as something that needed to be done. In his eyes, defending me meant creating conflict, and creating conflict was the thing he feared most. I didn't realize this was a real problem. I figured every couple had their mismatched parts. I thought with time, Elias would open up more, would understand that his silence wasn't an act of kindness. But then one day, I walked into our home and felt myself disappear, not physically, but in the sense that I was no longer a half of this marriage. I was just the person in charge of whatever Elias didn't want to touch, the things that needed clarity, needed someone to face them, needed someone to speak up. And Elias was still gentle. Gentle in the way people admired, gentle in the way that made others see him as a safe man. But safe for who? Certainly not for me. That dinner at his mom's house was just the final drop. When Elias said, "She's really sensitive," I realized the thing I had been avoiding for months. He was willing to let me be the one with the problem, as long as he didn't have to face anyone in the room. I sat there, quiet but not sad, just awake. And from that moment on, what I needed was no longer a gentleman. I needed someone brave enough to stand beside me, not hide behind polite smiles to keep things comfortable. After that dinner at Elias's mom's house, I realized I wasn't standing in the right place in this marriage anymore. But realizing it and accepting it were two different things. I didn't say anything in the car on the way home, neither did he. Not because things were tense, but because he had never known how to face someone's real feelings. But from that day on, I started seeing every small detail more clearly. The ones I used to brush aside. They weren't dramatic. There was no explosion that anyone else would find unusual. But to me, each moment was a small slice showing that Elias's fear of conflict wasn't a habit. It was a system. One morning, our neighbor knocked because they thought we'd dropped something on the floor the night before. I stepped out ready to explain. Elias followed. I assumed he'd say something simple like, "It wasn't us." But he looked at me, touched my hand gently, and whispered, like it was a signal, "Let me apologize." I could see the expectation in his eyes. Not the expectation of kindness, but the hope that the whole thing would end immediately. In the end, I let him apologize for us. A light, completely wrong apology, but perfectly aligned with what he wanted, to avoid any exchange that might last another 30 seconds. The neighbor nodded, smiled, and left. Elias exhaled in relief. I didn't. The second slice came during a get-together with my friends. Someone retold an old story, and because a few pieces were left out, it made me look unreasonable. I looked at Elias. He'd heard the full story back then. He knew I hadn't done anything wrong. He just smiled, stared at his glass, and said nothing. After I explained myself, my friend seemed to understand. Elias still stayed quiet. Later he told me, "You're too tense, it's just an old story." I didn't respond. I just wondered why he was always so quick to remove me from the picture so he could stay the gentle one. At home, everything became even clearer. I tried to have real conversations about money, planning, or even just deciding which side of the family to visit that weekend. But every time I started, Elias had the same reaction. His eyes drifted away, his hand tightened for a moment, then released, like he was searching for an invisible exit. One night, I asked him what he thought about redoing the office. A completely normal question. Elias looked at me, gave this uneasy smile, and said, "Whatever you want. I don't want to get into an argument." An argument? I was just asking for his opinion. I started to see it clearly. To Elias, any conversation that required him to stand in a viewpoint felt like conflict, and he'd avoid it at all costs, even if that meant avoiding me. But the hardest hit didn't come from something at home. It happened at a company group event. We were standing with a few of his coworkers. One of them brought up the incident where I was a few minutes late last time. I hadn't even opened my mouth before she pinned it all on me for not taking time seriously. Elias was right next to me, and he, the one who knew the real reason, stayed silent. Not a single correction, not even a small gesture, just a faint smile and his eyes dropping to the floor like he was afraid of attracting attention. I stood there listening to someone judge me while my husband was inches away, saying nothing. When the group finally split up, Elias turned to me with this relaxed look, as if what just happened left no mark at all. And he said the sentence I'll remember for a long time, "I just didn't want to make things uncomfortable." Uncomfortable for who? For me or for him? That moment felt like pulling off a mask he had worn too well. Elias wasn't gentle. He simply chose a pleasant atmosphere over the truth. And when he had to choose between the two, he chose the atmosphere. Chose comfort. Chose himself. I went home with a strange calm. Not disappointed, not angry, just clear. I realized I'd been put in the wrong place for a long time, not as a partner, but as an obstacle to avoid. That night I didn't ask Elias why. I didn't need to hear him say, "I didn't mean to," or "I just didn't want anyone to feel awkward." I'd heard those lines too many times to know they carried no weight. From that day on, I replayed every small piece of our marriage like watching silent footage. And I saw I'd slowly become the difficult woman in everyone's eyes. Not because I actually was, but because Elias was so excessively gentle in a way that made anyone standing next to him look like the one creating pressure. He was always polite, always gentle, always avoiding any friction, and in other people's eyes, that turned me into the one with the opposite energy. They didn't understand that his gentleness was exactly what forced me to speak more clearly, reason more directly, and sometimes hold a firm line just to stay true to myself. The gentler they thought he was, the more they assumed I was too much. I started to realize something sharper than anything anyone had ever said. His gentleness cast me as the villain. He didn't need to speak badly about me. All he had to do was stay quiet. And that silence became the loudest voice in the room. One night, I sat in my office with the desk lamp on while the house stayed still, as if every emotion from the day had already died. I tried to figure out where I went wrong, not in a self-blaming way, in an analytical one, and I realized I wasn't wrong. I had just assigned the wrong meaning to the word gentle. Elias wasn't gentle out of love for others. He was gentle to hide, gentle to keep himself safe, gentle so he never had to face anything that required courage. I put my pen down, took a long breath. Not hurt, just awake. I knew I was getting close to a point where this marriage could never stay the way it was. Not because of some big fight, but because I was done carrying his fear on my shoulders. And there was something I hadn't said to Elias, but I knew it clearly. I was ready, for the first time, to face the truth with him, not for him. I had one sentence in my head, sharp and cold. If he's that afraid of conflict, then I'll make him face the cost of avoiding it. Elias's family invited us over for dinner one weekend. I didn't expect much. These dinners always followed the same rhythm. They talked, Elias blended into the easy flow, and I stayed just far enough on the outside not to get pulled into unnecessary opinions. But that night, there was something I didn't know. They had heard a story about me. And, as usual, Elias hadn't corrected it. As soon as we walked in, his mom touched my arm lightly, like a warning. "We'll talk in a bit," she said, her voice not accusing, but not warm either. Dinner went smoothly for a while. I watched Elias. He looked relaxed, familiar, and as always, unaware of the small signals I was already picking up. But when the conversation shifted toward family matters, the tone in the room changed. A younger cousin asked Elias if he felt pressured having to put up with my rigidity in some recent situations. I looked up, tilted my head slightly, waiting to see what Elias would do. He stayed silent, just for a few seconds, but to me it was confirmation. They asked again, clearer this time, "Is it true Marin makes it hard to settle weekend plans?" Elias said he has to give in to her a lot. I turned to Elias. His eyes flicked across the table and landed on his glass, as if it could answer for him. I knew in that moment he wasn't confused. He was choosing the path with the least conflict for himself. Then he spoke. "She's just a bit too rigid." The room didn't explode, but the soft pause that followed his words was heavier than any accusation. Once again, I'd been placed in the exact role Elias always pushed me into, the one causing pressure, the one who's too much, the rigid one. I didn't feel angry. I just felt a line appear, clean and bright, and I knew that if I stepped over it, everything would change. I set my fork and knife down, slow and steady. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't either. "Elias doesn't defend me," I said, eyes on him, "because he's afraid to face anything, including himself." No one said a word. Not because they were shocked, but because the sentence couldn't be denied. It hit the exact center of something made all sensed but never named. Elias froze. Not because what I said was wrong, but because I'd let others see the part of him he always hid. The ground under that gentle exterior he wore, like a thin mask. His mother looked down at the table. The cousin swallowed hard. No one defended Elias. No one blamed me. No one said I was overreacting. That was the real shock. The truth about him was no longer something only I could see. Elias tried to speak. His mouth opened, then closed. The hand resting on his knee tightened, then loosened. He couldn't find the words, or rather, he didn't have the courage to argue, because what I said wasn't an attack. It was the truth he himself was terrified to face. In his eyes, for the first time, I saw something other than avoidance. I saw recognition. A realization that the gentleness he thought was a virtue had become a form of harm to the person standing right beside him. The air at the table wasn't heavy. It was just empty. As if everyone suddenly understood that the picture they'd believed in wasn't the real one. I set my napkin down. "I'm going to step outside for a bit," I said, steady, unhurried. No one stopped me. Not because they wanted me gone, but because they needed time to recalibrate how they saw Elias. And Elias needed time to stand in this new light, a light he didn't choose, but couldn't escape anymore. I walked out of the dining room. The door closed softly behind me, but I heard Elias stand up. He didn't follow. I knew he didn't know what to say if he faced me right then. He'd never had to confront the truth in a way that couldn't be smoothed over with a small, polite smile. In the hallway, I stood for a moment. Not to calm down. I wasn't upset. I stood there to look back at what had just happened. I didn't regret what I said, and I didn't see it as a blow. It was just a mirror. Elias wasn't a bad person, but he was someone who let fear lead instead of courage, and that fear, over time, had twisted me into a distorted version of myself in other people's eyes. I walked back into the dining room after a while. The conversation was quieter, but the way they looked at Elias had changed. Not hostile, just clearer. They saw his avoidance. They saw that his silence wasn't some noble restraint. I saw Elias sitting there, uncomfortable, not because of what I said, but because he knew I had just done what he never dared to do: speak the truth in a room full of people. I sat down. No one mentioned what happened. They treated me with a kind of respect they used to reserve only for Elias. And that, more than anything, made him shrink further into himself. When dinner ended, Elias got up faster than usual. I took my time with my coat. He held the door open but didn't look at me. I knew he wanted to say something, but the words stayed stuck in his throat. He drove home in silence. But this time, I didn't feel abandoned inside that silence. I stood outside of it, watching it like something he would have to face on his own. That night, when we got home, Elias sat down on the couch, his hands clasped together. I looked at him, a gentle man, a frightened man. A man who, for the first time, had been forced to see the truth of himself reflected through someone else's eyes. I didn't say another word. I didn't need to. What I'd said at the dinner table had already done what it needed to do. Not hurt him, but take away the place he hid. I went into the bedroom and closed the door softly, not to avoid him, but to let the moment have its full weight. It was a necessary break, a drop before everything shifted into the phase where I knew I would no longer step back. And Elias, for the first time, couldn't pretend things were fine. The next morning, when I woke up, the house was as quiet as always. But the quiet didn't feel familiar anymore. It felt like a space between two worlds, where Elias still stood on one side and I'd stepped onto the other. Not leaving him, just leaving the old way we lived. Elias was sitting at the kitchen table, hands around a warm mug. When I walked in, he looked up as if bracing for blame. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to anymore. Not because I was done communicating, but because I knew from now on, communication wouldn't depend on whether Elias had the courage to participate. I set my car keys on the table. "We're talking today," I said, my voice level, not raised, not sharp. He nodded, his head dipping a little as if accepting blame, a familiar reflex. But I no longer felt any need to soften that gesture. "From now on," I said, "you don't get to use silence to dodge responsibility." Elias blinked, his brow tightening. I didn't give him time to decide whether he should defend himself or apologize. "I'll be clear," I went on. "If someone misunderstands me, you speak up. If someone uses me as the excuse to keep things smooth, you correct it. And if there's something in this house that needs a decision, you say what you want. But if you hide, then I decide." Every word dropped onto the kitchen table like small stones, sharp and clean. No anger, just truth. Elias tightened his grip on the mug. I heard his breath change. He'd lived for years relying on comfort, on avoiding every sharp edge in life. And now I was pulling that curtain down, not to shame him, but to end the pattern where I carried every hard part alone. "You're upset about last night," he said quietly. "No," I said. "I'm awake because of last night." He looked at me for a long moment, as if searching for the version of me he used to know. The one who tried to understand him, who stepped back for him, who reassured herself that his silence was just exhaustion. But that version was gone. Not because I'd changed, but because I had finally seen what I'd avoided naming for too long. I stood up and folded the napkin on the table. "You need to learn to speak. Not speak more, speak right." Elias didn't argue, but the confusion in his eyes was real. He looked like someone being pulled out of a blanket he'd wrapped around himself since childhood. The gentleness, the avoidance, the self-made image of the man who never makes anyone uncomfortable. The first step toward change happened that very afternoon. A small moment. My friend texted saying she wasn't sure about weekend plans because she didn't know if I'd be tense, the way Elias had once implied. I handed him the phone, no anger, no blame. You explain it, I said. Elias stared at the screen like it was the truth he'd created, but never thought he'd have to fix. After a few seconds, he typed a message saying he'd been wrong, that the issue was him avoiding discussions, not me. When he handed the phone back, his hand shook a little. But the message was direct. No soft patting, no evasive tone. I just nodded. No praise, no encouragement. No treating his effort like something rare or extraordinary. It should have been normal. A few days later, during a conversation with his younger brother, I saw Elias step in when the brother started blaming me for missing a previous gathering. Elias stopped him and said, "That was on me, not Marin." His voice was still gentle, but it didn't dodge. I looked at him, a short look, cool, but not distant. He was uneasy, but he didn't retreat. I changed things through small behaviors. When I asked what he wanted to eat, I didn't accept the usual, "whatever you want." I stood there and waited for a real answer. When someone in the family mentioned something that misrepresented me, I turned to Elias and let his silence become a question. He had to speak, and over time he did. My tone never rose above what was needed. I was calm enough that even when Elias stumbled, I didn't correct him with sharpness. I spoke clearly, briefly, like a straight line drawn on a table. Every time, Elias didn't get defensive. He simply accepted it. Not in a defeated way, but in a way that showed he knew it was the right thing. Elias started to change, but not in the way people write in romantic stories. There was no beautiful awakening, no long apologies, no heartfelt promises. His change came in small pieces, scattered and sometimes clumsy. But every piece came from the same realization. His avoidance wasn't keeping me close. It was pushing me away in a much quieter, deeper way. Elias saw it in my eyes, not anger, but the kind of look that takes the power back. He understood that if he kept living in silence, he wouldn't lose me by my leaving. He'd lose me while I was still standing next to him, because I would no longer see him as a partner. And for Elias, that was scarier than any argument could ever be. That weekend, when we needed to decide where to go, I tested it again. "What do you think?" I asked. Elias took a breath. "I want to stay home," he said, clearer than ever. "And I want to say that without being afraid you'll think I'm avoiding things." I nodded. Not in agreement or disagreement. Just acknowledgement. What I needed from him wasn't to think like me. It was to be honest in every sentence. By the end of that weekend, something was clear. Elias wasn't changing to please me. He was changing because he finally realized that the way he'd been living had left him standing outside his own life. And a marriage can't survive with two people standing outside their own lives. That night, after we turned off the lights, I heard his voice in the dark. "I don't want to be silent anymore." I didn't answer. Not because I didn't believe him, but because he would have to prove it in the days ahead, not with words. But I knew a door had opened. Not a door leading out of the marriage, a door leading him into the part of it where I'd been standing alone. The shift in our marriage became clearer from that moment. Not loud, not rushed, just the truth settling back into the place it belonged, and Elias finally being forced to grow up inside the quiet house that had sheltered him for too long. His change didn't arrive like some dramatic turn. It came like small ripples on water, subtle but steady. I saw him trying to speak more plainly, stand a little taller, stop using his smile as a shield for every situation. But I didn't see that as the result. Change isn't a handful of good days. It needs a test. And that test came sooner than I expected. One weekend evening, we met up with a group of mutual friends. I wasn't close with them, but close enough that I didn't have to be overly polite. While we were talking, someone in the group, the type who hides a lack of tact behind jokes, looked at me and said, "Is Marin always this serious? Must be tough for Elias." The comment wasn't sharp, but it hit the exact stereotype I'd been boxed into for months, partly because Elias had once left enough silence for people to assume that about me. I looked at him, not to ask for protection, but to see what he would choose. Elias stood beside me, his hand tightening slightly around his glass. Before, this was the moment he'd turn to another topic, or give a soft laugh to smooth things over. I knew that pattern well, but tonight something was different. He looked directly at the person before he looked at me. In that moment, I didn't wait. I observed. I let him step into his choice on his own, avoid or confront. Elias set his glass down. His voice was calm, low, steady. "Don't say that. Marin isn't who you think she is." That was it. Short, clear, polite, not harsh. But the calm in his voice was enough to quiet the whole group. Not because Elias spoke loudly, he didn't. It was because, for the first time, he wasn't standing behind me. He was standing beside me. Bookmark. It felt like someone had pulled back an old curtain in a room I'd been sitting in for too long. Not because I needed protection, but because Elias finally stepped into his rightful place. Not avoiding, not fading, not disappearing. The friend who made the comment laughed it off, trying to smooth over the moment he'd created. The others shifted the conversation. No one brought it up again. Elias glanced at me briefly. Not to check if I was okay, but to confirm that he had done the right thing. I tilted my head just slightly. No smile, no thank you. I didn't want to turn that moment into some achievement that needed praise. It had to be normal, and Elias understood that. He didn't wait for my reaction. He went back to the group conversation, his voice steady, without the awkwardness he used to carry. What I felt wasn't emotion, it wasn't warmth, it was confirmation. Confirmation that he could change when the truth became the safest choice. Not because he feared conflict, but because he feared losing what a marriage is supposed to be. Two people standing together, not one hiding, and one carrying the weight. When the gathering ended, we stepped out of the restaurant. Elias walked beside me, hands in his coat pockets. The space between us wasn't heavy, or awkward, or distant. It was just different. Like a new layer of air, we were both learning how to breathe. About earlier, he began. I know, I said, cutting in gently. Not irritated. Not cold. I just didn't need him to explain what I had already seen clearly. He nodded once, like someone who'd just been allowed to exhale. On the drive home, neither of us talked much. I looked out the window as the city light slid by slowly. I wasn't thinking about that friend. I was thinking about Elias, the man who'd been gentle to the point of trapping himself inside a version of safety he mistook for character. And I thought about how he'd just stepped out of that version, imperfectly but honestly. And I knew this. I didn't need Elias to become a strong man overnight. I just needed him to stand in the place an adult is meant to stand. When we got home, I took off my coat and set my bag on the chair. Elias stood a step behind me, silent, waiting to see if I had something to say. I turned and looked at him for a few seconds. I don't need a gentle man, I said. Steady. I need someone brave enough to stand next to me, not behind me, and not hiding behind other people. Elias didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He didn't try to explain. He took in those words the way someone receives a truth they'd known for a long time, but never had the courage to name. And what I saw in his eyes wasn't fear, it was determination. Not loud, not dramatic, but clear enough for me to know that the rest of this marriage, if it continued, would have two people fully inside it. I walked into the living room and turned on the light, not leaving him behind. He followed a few seconds later. He didn't try to close the distance. He didn't ask for reassurance. He just matched the pace, for the first time in the true sense of the word, with. This marriage didn't break. It also didn't return to what it was. It was rebuilt through clarity, from both of us. I didn't forgive in a way that softened everything. I didn't forget the times Elias stayed silent, but I also didn't let those moments dictate the entire future. I lived by new boundaries, and Elias had to grow within them. And for the first time, I saw that he truly wanted to grow. The rest of the story doesn't need drama. It only needs the truth. And the truth is this: sometimes a breakup isn't the solution. Sometimes the right kind of growth, at the right time, from both people, is what pulls a marriage back from drifting into two different worlds. That night, when I turned off the living room light, I heard Elias walk toward me. Not avoiding, not shrinking, not waiting for me to lead, just walking in the right place. A small action. But enough for me to know that this time, he wasn't choosing comfort, he was choosing me. In the end, here's what I learned. Not everyone gentle is safe. And not every conflict needs to be avoided. Some relationships only mature when both people dare to stand in the truth, instead of hiding behind their own fear. That's the end of my story. Thank you for spending your time listening to my journey. If you've lived through something similar, would you choose to face it? Or stay silent? Leave a comment. I'd like to hear your story. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next ones. Thank you for being here. I truly appreciate your presence.